Hello folks, J. Scott Phillips here and welcome to my channel. You can see I've got a little mood lighting going on here this time because tonight we are bound for terror with a look at H.P. Lovecraft's 1927 short story, Pickman's Model. And if you've seen my channel before, you probably already know that as well as talking about the stories and authors, I also like to talk about the art and artists that were inspired to create illustrations and cover art and such things for the stories that we talk about here on the channel. And in this particular case tonight, we're going to do some of that, certainly, but we are also going to talk about some of the art and artists that inspired H.P. Lovecraft to write Pickman's Model in the first place. He was a big fan of spooky, creepy art, and that directly influenced his story, Pickman's Model. Now, I should say that this is my late entry into the month of May here for Horror Mayhem, which is a month-long BookTube event in the month of May created by the Bookish Bryants a couple of years ago now, I think, to celebrate horror fiction, shorter horror fiction, which is any novel, 250 pages or less, all the way down to short stories. Now, let's get back to Pickman's Model here. I've been kind of looking forward to doing this because I had opportunity many years ago to illustrate a reprint version of Pickman's Model myself, and I've never really shown or talked about any of my own artwork on this channel. So this is an opportunity for me to do that. That'll be later on here, and there's a story behind that as well. But as I was saying, I was going to do this earlier in the month here, first week in May, because I've been looking forward to doing this for a while. But then when I sat down to reread the short story to prep for doing the video here, I was reminded pretty quickly into the story that it takes place in Boston. And I was going to be going to Boston in the middle of the month, in mid-May. And so I thought, rather than doing this before I go to Boston, I should probably do a little reconnoitering while I'm in Boston and go to some of the locations that are discussed in the story, take some pictures and some video or something, and see if that's worthwhile to sprinkle into this video here. So I put it off, and I'm only now getting to put it all together here into video form. So let's move on then with that, and let's chat a little bit about the story itself. Pickman's Model was first published in the October 1927 issue of Weird Tales magazine. And it's an interesting storytelling device that H.P. Lovecraft uses. A lot of people have said that our main character, Richard Upton Pickman, who is an artist, he is kind of a facsimile for Lovecraft himself, because the things that the philosophies that Pickman has and conveys in the story and creates his art revolving, all those kinds of dark themes and almost like a passion for the hideous and the gruesome kind of reflect Lovecraft's own, but instead of being a writer, he is a painter. And it's an interesting narrative device that Lovecraft uses because it is a story that is kind of a narrative within a narrative. You've got this one character, Thurber, his name is telling the story to this other character, Elliot. And as he's talking to Elliot, he's telling Elliot the story and the philosophies and ideas and concepts that Richard Upton Pickman had told to Thurber. So it's kind of a nested within another story, kind of a way of telling this tale, which is kind of involving. You keep kind of peeling layers back as you're reading this story. But the story revolves around Pickman, who is this artist who is, as I mentioned, he paints just the most hideous things that he can, I want to say, imagine. But I probably shouldn't say that. He just paints really, really disturbing, creepy, hideous, and gut-wrenching images that seem so real. People that look at it, look at his artwork, just cannot understand or even stomach how real some of the things that he paints are. And his artwork is so unnerving that it's getting him canceled in the art circles that he tries to have embrace him. It's so bad that he gets kicked out of the Boston Art Club, and he won't get represented or sponsored by any of the other members of the art club, and he can't even gift his art to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. They don't want to have anything to do with him either. It's just too gruesome and hideous. His artwork is just simply nightmarish. And so as the character Thurber is telling his friend Elliot, apparently another member of the art club, why Pickman has just been canceled so thoroughly. And now Pickman has gone missing. And the police are kind of looking for Pickman. And Thurber doesn't want to get involved because he thinks he knows where Pickman may have disappeared from, but he doesn't ever want to go back there again because he's just found out some things about Boston at night and underground Boston and cemeteries and things that Pickman related to him. He doesn't want to have anything to do with that, and he's just terrified of that. So it's a gripping story about the world of art, and because of Pickman's particular penchant for the gruesome, it's really a compelling story. And one of the things that makes it so gripping, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people probably, is that Lovecraft in this particular story is a master at blurring the lines between fantasy and reality. He uses a lot of actual locations as the setting for his story, places that you could go to even today. And a lot of his characters are actual people or institutions, actual institutions. Historic characters that actually lived are some characters in his story. So there is a lot of reality cooked into the tale itself. And so you believe in Pickman as you're reading it, and you can buy into so much of it. And that's kind of the point in Pickman's artwork itself, is that he paints things that make people believe this could be real. It's on canvas, so you're a step away from what Pickman is actually trying to depict. And so are we in reading the story one step away from what's actually happening in Boston in the 1920s or whenever this story takes place. So, as I mentioned before, I was in Boston here just recently. And so, having just read the story, I decided that it was important that perhaps I explore some of the places that Pickman had reason to believe that terror lived. This is Copp's Hill Burying Ground, which is in the north end of Boston, and it's one of the settings that figures prominently in the story. This is the second oldest cemetery in Boston. It goes back to the 1600s, and Cotton Mather is actually buried here, so that has connections to the Salem witch hunts and witch trials, of which apparently Richard Upton Pickman has ancestry going back to those days and to those very people. So he would haunt the, no pun intended, the burying ground here, and he would take his camera at night and shoot reference photos like a lot of illustrators and painters would do once cameras became somewhat readily available. Would rather than having necessarily models posing for them live, they could often take pictures and work from photos. This was in the beginning days of that. And so he would go in at night and take pictures of the scenery and the settings, the tombstones, and so you can see some of the buildings in the distance outside the cemetery, and really capture a sense of place and reality in the painting. And there were some other things going on in the cemetery there that he might be capturing or painting from life. And when I was there during broad daylight, as you could see by the clip there, I was glad that they lock that place up at night now. I don't think they did that back in Pickman's day. And I think it might be a result of what Pickman knew to be going on there. And so I don't think that locking it up at night is to keep people out of there. It's to keep something in. And So that's just my own opinion, but having been there, I can tell you that I'm glad there's iron gates all around that place. Now, here is the Boston Art Club that is in the Back Bay area of Boston. And when I was there, it's pretty well overgrown now with trees around it, which are nice and scenic. It's really hard to see the building, though, as it was back in Pickman's days with all the trees and traffic out in front of it. So I'll also put up a little picture here of how it looked back in Pickman's time. So you can see what the art club was at that time. Now, the art club, Boston Art Club, was an actual institution there, and it was to sponsor and educate people about artwork, make sales of artwork, and promote the classic art of the day and the new artists coming up. And it existed up until about 1950 when it was kind of I want to say a dying art, but that might not be a good choice of words in this particular story. But it evolved into something else until today. I think the Boston Art Club is still an entity, but it's just online only. And the building there itself that was originally built for the art club is now some kind of a trade school or something, I believe. Not quite sure what it is now. But the building itself is still there, and you can still go up and touch the brown stone, and it's you can certainly get a vibe off of it, and it's part of old Boston there that still exists, as many places in Boston have that vibe and feeling and history. It's really a cool place to walk around and just immerse yourself. Now, let me read you a few paragraphs from the story itself here as kind of an example of what I'm talking about the way that Lovecraft is using actual names and philosophies to convey that reality that he's trying to get across to us here that helps us to buy into the true nature of the story and believe in it. And so this is our friend Thurber here, the main narrator of the story, talking to his friend Eliot after he's been dealing with Pickman. And he's saying to Eliot, you know, it takes profound art and profound insight into nature to turn out stuff like Pickman's. Any magazine cover hack can splash paint around and wildly call it a nightmare or a witch's sabbath or a portrait of the devil, but only a great painter can make such a thing really scare or ring true. That's because only a real artist knows the actual anatomy of the terrible or the physiology of fear, the exact sort of lines and proportions that connect up with latent instincts or hereditary memories of fright, and the proper color contrast and lighting effects to stir the dormant sense of strangeness. I don't have to tell you why a Fuseli really brings a shiver while cheap ghost story frontispiece merely makes us laugh. There is something those fellows catch beyond life that they're able to make us catch for a second. Doré had it. Sime has it. Angarola of Chicago has it. And Pickman had it as no man ever had it before, or, I hope to heaven, ever will again. And so he drops several artist names here that are painting in a style that inspires Lovecraft himself in being able to imagine the hideous and the deplorable. And so that those kinds of things inspired Lovecraft. So let's take a look and maybe we'll get a little bit more insight. I know when you're reading a story like this and names come floating across, if you're not already familiar with them, you just kind of let them roll over you and you get the gist of the story. But in the case of Pickman's model, it's also really helpful to just grasp the reality of what he's trying to convey here. So let's take a look at some of those artists here and just touch on a piece of their work a piece and a piece of their work a piece and see how that informs us. The first artist name that Lovecraft drops is Johann Heinrich Fuseli. And if you remember, Thurber had just been talking to Eliot and he said, I don't have to tell you why a Fuseli really brings a shiver, while a cheap ghost story frontispiece merely makes us laugh. So in this particular painting here called The Nightmare, it was painted in 1781, Fuseli is created a really great metaphor for Pickman's own philosophy. At one point, Pickman in the story said, I decided long ago that one must paint terror as well as beauty from life. And in this painting, we see both terror and beauty working together to tell this little ghost story here. It depicts a beautiful woman who's in a very vulnerable position here. And it was believed at the time this was painted that sleeping on your back could lead to nightmares. And so that is apparently what's happening here, if we can only hope that it's just a nightmare and not reality here. Again, we're blurring that line. And we see the pure light that is on our young lady here is representing that virtue, while everything sinister and evil is lurking in the dark shadows of the painting here. That creature that's squatting on her womb is an incubus, and that was a male demon that was believed to come into the bedchambers of women at night and have intercourse with them. So there's that threat. And then in the background, we see that horse's head peering out through the curtain there. And that is a Mara. That's from Scandinavian folklore, is a female spirit that will come to you and by writing on your chest or stomach will bring you nightmares. And so this horse here, the Mara, she's peeking through that slit that is intentionally vaginal in appearance here. So there is a lot going on subliminally and suggestively in this painting to really give us a shiver, as Pickman, or as Lovecraft is trying to tell us. And not to read too much more into this painting, but it's interesting to note, I think, that the model that Fuseli used in this and many other paintings was Sophia Rollins, and he wound up falling in love with her eventually, and they got married. So I'm kind of hoping that Fuseli is not working a self-portrait somewhere into this painting. But be that as it may, let's move on to the next name of an artist that Lovecraft is dropping, and it comes from there's something those fellows catch beyond life that they're able to make us catch for a second. Doré had it. So that's Gustave Doré. Let's take a look at something of his work. Of all the artist names that Thurber was rolling off there, Gustave Doré is probably the one that readers will be the most familiar with, which is good because if you know anything of Doré's work and nothing of the other artists that are mentioned, you will at least get a good sense of the subject matter and types of artwork that is trying to be described here. And there are so many Dorés to choose from. Just to pick one for this video here, I just picked a favorite one of mine, and this happens to be The Rebel Angels, which was created in 1870, and it's a plate for Milton's Paradise Lost. And again, like the Fuseli we were just looking at, it's also divided into kind of equal portions of light and dark, and representing the beautiful and the terrible all at once. And it's depicting the banishment of Satan and his minions, of his rebel angels, as they are fighting the forces of heaven up above. And that glowing light up above there naturally is the presence of God, and the figure that's silhouetted against it is the Archangel Michael. And it's interesting here to me, the lighting effects that Doré gives us, because up at the top, we've got the brilliance of heaven, and yet the Archangel Michael is silhouetted against it. So he is a dark figure, while the figure of Satan down below is being bathed in that holy light from above. And so he is the lightest figure, kind of using a little bit of a yin-yang thing there that I think is really interesting in depicting that moment of folklore. Getting back to Thurber's roster of artist names here, he had said Doré had it, Sime has it, and that would be Sidney Sime, who was a British illustrator who was well known for his fabulous illustrations, mostly for an Irish author, a fantasy writer by the name of Lord Dunsany. This is Sime's illustration for The City of Never, which was a short story from Lord Dunsany's collection of short stories, The Book of Wonder. It was published in 1913. It's a very poetic story, but it doesn't really have any kind of a plot. It's mostly a description of a city at the edge of the world, of this fantastic world, and kind of a story, I guess you could call it, of a little boy that was foretold to grow up someday and enter that world as a man. And he had been given a magic halter at some point that he could capture and control mythical creatures with it. And then one day, as he is grown up, he enters that world and he catches a hippogriff. That's a mythical creature that has the head and wings and forelegs of an eagle and the hindquarters of a horse. And then he catches the hippogriff and then he flies around the city and kind of explores it and just soaks it in. Nothing really happens other than just kind of expressing what he sees of this world. And so he sees this beautiful city of light that has domes and turrets and spires in the distance. And then there are these pits, the underpits, that something down there with just eyes that are watching him. So again, you're seeing the terror and the beauty working together in these kinds of illustrations here. And again, we're kind of split halfway between darkness and light. And I think we can really start to see a pattern developing here that plays right into the theme of Pickman's model. And so getting back to Thurber's list here, Doré had it, Sime has it, Angarola of Chicago has it. So let's take a look at some of Anthony Angarola's work. This is one of 12 illustrations that Angarola did for Ben Hecht's 1924 story, The Kingdom of Evil. And Angarola was actually one of Lovecraft's favorite illustrators and always wanted him to illustrate some of his own work. And Angarola himself had at one point read Lovecraft's short story, The Outsider, and liked it so much that he wanted to illustrate that. And he actually petitioned Weird Tales to see if he could get the assignment. But unfortunately, by the time Weird Tales got his request, they had already commissioned the artwork elsewhere. So he did not get to do that, nor did he ever get to illustrate any of Lovecraft's work later on, because unfortunately he died young as the result of injuries of a car crash. But this book, The Kingdom of Evil by Ben Hecht, is often cited as being written in a very Lovecraftian style. So this is probably the closest we'll ever get to see what Angarola's work for an actual Lovecraft story might have looked like. It's a pretty gruesome story of a man that was kidnapped into slavery in this nightmare world and is forced to help build a god of all things. And so in this particular drawing, we see that god has come to power and is being attacked by an army of mannequins. And the god will continue to hack at the mannequins and behead them, but they just keep going because they're actually puppets that are being controlled remotely and cannot be stopped. So after a 3-day battle, the army of mannequins can finally subdue this giant god. Now, Angarola tended to work a lot of his own personal experience into his art. He was the proud son of Italian immigrants, and so he enjoyed depicting people in his art that are confronting and conquering unknown worlds. And we can see this illustration here is a really good example of that. He was a lapsed Catholic, so he liked to use religious imagery to express secular subject matter. And again, I guess I should point out once more, we're seeing that use of solid darks and solid lights in equal proportions again in even Angarola's artwork here. So really some running themes through all of these artists. And then a little later in the story, Thurber is still talking to Eliot, and he says, "You recall that Pickman's forte was faces. I don't believe anybody since Goya could put so much of sheer hell into a set of features or a twist of expression." So let's take a look at an example of artwork from Francisco Goya. This painting is usually called Saturn Devouring His Son or Saturn Devouring His Children. And Goya painted this sometime, we're not quite sure, sometime between 1819 and 1823. But it's often cited as one of the most horrific paintings of all time, and I think you can see why. It depicts the Greek myth of Saturn, or going by the Roman name Kronos, the same deity. And Saturn knew of the prophecy that one day one of his children would grow up and usurp his throne, take away his power. And so as a precaution, Saturn would consume those children as they were born. Now, usually depicted as consuming young infants, but in this case, it's interesting that Goya painted him as an adult. And that could be because Goya painted from life, not painted from life like Pickman painted from life, but from his own life experience, I should say, and in metaphor. So this painting here is kind of reflective of some of the hell that Goya lived through during his lifetime. I didn't mention, but Goya, if you don't know, was a Spanish painter, and he grew up during some tumultuous times. He had originally had some royal connections painting for King Charles III and his court, and then on to Charles IV. And so then he saw the rise of Ferdinand VII and overthrew Charles IV. So much like Saturn's children rising up to usurp his power, he saw this happening in his own country when Ferdinand overthrew Charles IV, and then Napoleon came through in the Peninsular Wars, so there was that, and then after those wars, Ferdinand VII regained power and then started to once again unravel all the reforms that had been made. So Goya saw government after government just chewing on the government that came before, much like this painting here. Now, aside from just the sheer grotesqueness of the painting, I think one of the interesting things about it is that it was never meant to be seen by the public. It's probably why he was so expressive in the hideous nature of it. But he had seen a lot of hell in his life, like I had mentioned. And in his later years, he went through a lot of dark emotions, and he still needed to express that, and he felt free to do it if he could just paint these paintings on the walls of his own house. He had moved into this little farmhouse outside of Madrid to kind of get away from it all, I guess. And so he just got a lot of it out of his system by decorating his house with these large murals that depicted just what he was feeling inside. And he felt in the privacy of his own home, he could let those demons out in the form of artwork. So they're rather darker than anything that he would have done for any other purpose. But they weren't discovered until after his death. And I think once they were found, we can see that even in his darkest moments towards the end of his life, he still had a sense of humor, because Saturn Devouring His Son, he had painted on the wall of his dining room. So there we have a lot of the artists that influenced Lovecraft in the writing of Pickman's model. So now let's kind of shift gears and look at some of the art that Pickman's model inspired for the story. This first drawing is interesting because it's by H.P. Lovecraft himself. And I did not mention earlier what it was that Pickman is actually painting. He was painting ghouls, these creatures that had lived in these hidden tunnels and lost, forgotten labyrinth of passageways underneath old Boston, apparently for centuries. And so they would come up at night into places like cemeteries and in later years subways and feast on the corpses of the recently buried, or even attacking people in dark alleys or subway corridors and things like that for a fresh kill if they needed to. So that's what Pickman was painting. And one of his descriptions in the story was that they had a dog-like appearance. And so that seems key in a lot of the discussion that we're going to be looking at here in the illustrations coming up. And so H.P. Lovecraft is drawing this kind of lurching, almost a Bigfoot type character here, but with a dog-shaped head. And it's rather crude, I think, and I don't think it's necessarily all that accurate, even though it was done by H.P. Lovecraft himself. And even though a lot of people will say that Pickman is modeled after, no pun intended, was modeled after Lovecraft. Lovecraft did that intentionally. But my contention is that while that I think is true, that Lovecraft is in this story also as the character of Eliot. And so he is being told this story and then is telling it to us, almost in the same way as that Dr. Watson tells us the stories of Sherlock Holmes that then Arthur Conan Doyle tells to us. So I think that that can excuse, I'm not sure I'm using my words properly here, but that will explain why I'm saying that H.P. Lovecraft's own depiction of his own creature here is not so accurate compared to some of the things that we're going to be talking about here in a minute. As I mentioned earlier, Pickman's model was first published in the October 1927 issue of Weird Tales. It did not make the cover illustration, but it did have an interior drawing by Hugh Rankin. Rankin was best known as being an illustrator for Weird Tales from 1927 to 1936 thereabouts. And this illustration that he's given us here is a little misleading, judging by that rat there, assuming that that is probably one of the ghouls that we were talking about that is reaching over towards the rat. Now, this is not a literal scene in the story. Might be a minor spoiler alert, but not really. It's just that at one point in the story, Thurber is down in Pickman's underground studio, which might be a little too close to these underground tunnels that for comfort's sake. And Thurber he hears this scurrying and scuttling in the dark shadows and believes it to be a rat or rats, or at least hope that it's rats. He's not really sure, but that's his best guess. Now, I do like this illustration. I really like the composition of it. I like the hand lettering of the title and the author's name there. Very nice composition. Again, we've got those lights against darks. The only thing that bugs me, and this bugs me a lot of times, is that it doesn't match the description in the story. It does not look dog-like at all. This bloated creature here has a kind of almost a Dr. Seuss appearance to it in some way. And then just the relationship between the ghoul, the creature there, and the rat doesn't seem right. They seem actually kind of friendly somehow. And that just doesn't ring true to the horrific story. But that was the only illustration we had to go by for quite a while until in 1951, the December issue of Famous Fantastic Mysteries reprinted the story with an illustration by a big fan favorite, Hans Bach. This is probably the most well-known illustration we have so far of the creature from Pickman's model. And I think that's probably due to the popularity of the artist himself, Hans Bach here. He was a fan favorite, but I don't think he did his homework on this drawing here. It really doesn't look like any of the depiction in the story itself again, and that, like I say, that always bugs me. But aside from that, I've never been a fan of Hans Bach myself. I do appreciate his technique and his use of light and dark. He seems to have a pretty good control of that. But he was not formally trained. He was a fan artist to start with. So his drawings and proportions often seem just too cartoony to me. And that always seems to take away, particularly in a case like this story here, it takes away some of the terror and horror. It's almost making almost kind of fun of it somehow. But aside from that, in this drawing, he does have a dog-like face, but only barely. It probably looks more like a lion to me with that big mane of hair. So again, not quite accurate to the description, not to mention that just judging by the scale alone, it's clutching a human being in one hand there. So that gives us a sense of size, that if this ghoul were to stand up, he'd got to be at least 30 feet tall, which would make it pretty hard for him to hide in the shadows at night or squeeze through all those dark tunnels under the cemeteries and subway stations, and to get away with not being discovered. But reading way too much into an illustration like that, but those are the devil in the details that I always need to check myself on. Now, we're going to jump away from illustrating the printed word to something a little more modern. A lot of people might know the story of Pickman's model, not from having read the H.P. Lovecraft story, but from seeing the Rod Serling's TV series Night Gallery. In 1971, they did an episode of Pickman's model. And this was the gallery painting that was used for the titles of that episode, and then also featured prominently in the episode itself. This is not just an illustration for the story. It was painted by Tom Wright, who did a lot of the paintings for Night Gallery. And it is supposed to actually be a Pickman painting. And so it wasn't used just for the titles at the beginning of the episode, but was also a prop used throughout the story and figured prominently. Of all the artwork that we've looked at so far, I think that this one is the closest to looking like a real Pickman. Now, it doesn't have that dog quality, the dog-like appearance that is described in the written story by Lovecraft, but this is a TV production, so the description never really comes up of that, so it doesn't matter so much. Yet it does capture, I think, the essence of what Lovecraft was after, and it works really well in the story. I really like all the dark blues, and again, we've got the contrast with the shimmering light along the mist there, and it's probably moonlight in the graveyard there. So this really does look like, other than, again, the literal description in the story, which we don't have the benefit of watching the TV episode, it really captures that quality, and it certainly is horrific enough. If you've never seen the Night Gallery episode and would like to, and you don't have access to an old VHS tape or something, I did find a link for it while I was doing the research for this video, and I'll post it down below so you can see the whole episode. There's also a couple other short stories in the same hour show as a little bonus there. But it's kind of fun to watch. It's got some great artwork in it, the Pickman art. And but then it does have some period production issues as far as wardrobe and acting style and all that. But whenever I can make a Star Trek reference in my videos, I'll make it. And you might be interested to know that one of the characters in it is played by Louise Sorrell, who played Reyna in the Star Trek original series episode Requiem for Methuselah. So, and she's as lovely as ever in this particular episode. So you've got two things going for it. You've got the Pickman art, and you've got Louise Sorrell. And now we get to the creme de la creme. This one is beautiful. Maybe you've heard of the Netflix series, the Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, which is currently running. And they did an episode of Pickman's model. And there's artwork all through it, and it's beautiful. And by beautiful, I guess in this case, I mean horrible. But it really captures all that you want from this story, except for that dog-like appearance. But again, we don't have the written word to deal with in the television production, so it doesn't really matter so much. But just look at the exquisite painting here that was done by Vincent Proce. Now, I don't know this for sure, but I think this was actually created digitally. I think he does a lot of work digitally. And so that really adds to the reality then of what's supposed to be a painting in Pickman's time. Vincent Proce created a lot of artwork, paintings, drawings, rough sketches for this story that we see scattered throughout the episode. And we never really get, this is one of the great things about the television presentation, I think, is we never really get a great look at any particular painting. We see them in passing or hanging on walls at angles or covered up because they're one's tacked in front of another, things like that. You never really get that really clean look at it, but I was able to find one online. Actually, there are several online that you could look at, but I chose this one because it's probably the most horrific one of all. And rather than having one ghoul feeding, we have a number of them all feasting. And it looks as though they may be inaugurating somebody new into their number somehow. It's very realistic and really hits the nail on the head as far as what Lovecraft, I think, was after. Now, Cabinet of Curiosities does take a lot of license with the Lovecraft story itself, but it works really well. They change it up quite a bit, but it's based on a lot of the characters from the Lovecraft story, but enhanced. It goes a few steps further. And again, there are so many pieces of art in this episode that it's just a lot of eye candy for me to chew on as we go through the story. So I would encourage you to watch it if you're a Lovecraft fan or a Pickman's Model fan at all. Now, here's where the plot thickens. If you remember my contention from earlier that even though we've seen a lot of great illustrations for Pickman's Model so far, I don't believe that any of them are very accurate, really. And I believe the reason for that is that none of those artists or illustrators, including H.P. Lovecraft himself, ever had the benefit of having seen a real Pickman painting in real life. And that explains why none of them are particularly accurate. And even H.P. Lovecraft, if you recall my analogy there with the Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle never actually saw Professor Moriarty fall off of Reichenbach Falls to his death. But he told us about it. Just as H.P. Lovecraft never saw a real Pickman painting, even though he wrote us about it. So, in order to explain that, I'll have to go back into a little of my own backstory here. And so, if you'll indulge me, going back to the mid to late 1980s, long time ago now. But I was involved working with a group of friends on an annual neighborhood haunted house that we called Horror Hall. And it was just done in a regular neighborhood house. But two of the guys that I was working with, close friends of mine that I met working in a couple of restaurants at Disneyland back in college, went on eventually to both become Imagineers for Disney. And so early on, when we were working on this project, they were involved in creating new Imagineer-style tableaus as much as we could as amateurs back then. Really got a lot of really cool effects going through that house. So rather than having the harem-scarum type of haunted houses where people jump out at you in mass out of the dark, or having you stick your hands into a bowl of grapes and tell you that they're eyeballs, that kind of thing, ours was a little bit more of an intellectual type of haunted house. Not even so much like the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland, but you were led through the house by a host who would present these different rooms, and you, as you stood in there, you would witness all these hauntings and seances and laboratory experiments and things going on. The backyard was a graveyard. We had a Pepper's ghost in a mausoleum. All kinds of really cool effects. Now, my two buddies, Stephen R. Abernathy, now Captain Steve Abernathy, retired, and John Gritz. Those two guys. Steve was he had a background in art and literature, and so he was kind of a concept guy, an artist and a painter himself, and a designer, whereas John he was more of the engineer and the mechanic and the guy who could build all these things. So Steve would come up with the ideas, and John would then build them, and we'd all pitch in back and forth to help things. And they recruited me to come in and work on this haunted house. It was a lot of fun. We did it for years. And at that same time, I was working at the Orange County Register as a mild-mannered graphic designer for a great suburban newspaper. And the desktop publishing was just coming in at that time. And I'd always been fascinated by newspapers and newsletters, and even as a little kid would hand draw and print my own little clubhouse newsletters for the neighborhood kids and all that. And in 1989, I wanted to start learning this software for page layout called PageMaker, and I wanted to do a newsletter, a newspaper kind of thing. I was already working for one. I wanted to produce my own. And I thought, what could it be of? And the idea struck me that maybe it's a newsletter for our horror hall team, telling them about what we're working on, what we're going to be working on, some of the new creative ideas that we're doing, and then share that with everybody to keep everyone kind of up to date. We used to work on this thing year round. Halloween would come and go, and we'd start working right away on effects for the next year. So something we did for years, week after week. And so I knew I couldn't do this myself. I wanted to have artwork, and I needed someone to help me write articles and things like that. So I went to Steve Abernathy. And so he had an idea to add to it. He had grown up also as a big fan of horror fiction. And he said, as long as we're doing this, maybe we can add another element to this newsletter of yours and educate and train and explain some of the genre of horror. Because not many of us, we all love haunted houses, of course, but none of us really know the background or the history or the lore of horror fiction or mythology, just that kind of a thing. So we had the idea that we could put all of that in the newsletter as well, and then both of us could illustrate the stories and go from there. Each issue we would reprint a horror story from the classic literature that was in the public domain, and then Steve and or I would do the illustrations for it. But Steve himself was also a connoisseur of horrific artwork. And he got the idea, I think, from watching Night Gallery. And so he started to collect his own Night Gallery that he called his Fright Gallery. And the collection of paintings were masterpieces of the macabre. And that became a regular running feature in our newsletter. I guess I should show it to you here. We came out with this newsletter here called the Midnight Crier. And this is the summer '89 issue in which we ran Pickman's model. And that is because Steve had just acquired for his Fright Gallery collection an actual Richard Upton Pickman painting. And he was all excited about it. And so he wanted to write that for his for the summer issue of Masterpieces of the Macabre in 1989. And then that naturally led us to, well, we better run Pickman's model along with it. And I will put up a photo that I took of the painting back in 1989, so you can look at it while I read his actual Masterpieces of the Macabre article here from that issue. Masterpieces of the Macabre, Stephen R. Abernathy, curator. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We offer up, hopefully salutary, possibly enduring, but certainly a few terrifying little items in this, the Mausoleum for the Malignant, and a few demoniacal inhabitants, all put together for your pleasure and titillation in what we call the Fright Gallery. Those amongst our readers who are students of dark fantasy will recognize the painting offered this month as being nothing less than one of the few surviving works of that master of morbid art, that nauseous wizard who woke the fires of hell in pigment, Boston artist Richard Upton Pickman. Discovered in a window seat during the demolition of one of the ancient slum blocks in Boston's notorious North End, not far from Copp's Hill Burying Ground, the painting has hung as a curiosity in a small antique shop on Hanover Street. It hung there from 1957 until 1962, when a shrewd bookseller recognized it for what it was and bought it for the ridiculously economic price of $125. After the death of the bookseller, the picture found its way into and out of no less than 7 private collections until, in 1986, it came under the gavel at the Distinguished Art and Antique Auction House of Sotheby and Sotheby in New York, where it was purchased for the Fright Gallery by an anonymous patron. As only 9 authenticated Pickmans are known to survive, housed in private collections stretching from Boston to Osaka, Japan, we felt it a great honor to boast one in the Masterpieces of the Macabre collection and take great pride in presenting it here for your enjoyment and edification. Now, you can see that the actual Pickman painting only hints at a dog-like appearance, and that's probably the source of the description that Lovecraft gave us. But it does have a snout and the muzzle of a dog. But other than that, to me, it's kind of a bit of a Klingon Wolfman hybrid, which is horrific enough. Now, when we were producing this newsletter back in 1989, I took a photo of the actual painting so that I could run it in the newsletter. And we were only a black and white publication then. We just printed it at Kinko's every month. And so I have this black and white photo of it here, and that's the one I was just showing to you. But since I knew I was going to be doing this Pickman's model video here, I got in touch with Captain Steve. We're still good pals. He doesn't live in California anymore. But I asked him if he could just go and take a color photo of it with his phone, and that would probably be fine for the video here. But alas, he no longer has it in his collection. And he wrote me an email back explaining what's happened to it now. So I'll just read it to you here. He says, "Ahoy, Mr. Phillips. Thank you for your inquiry regarding the painting depicting a ghoul feeding by Boston artist Richard Upton Pickman. While the painting used to be a part of my Masterpieces of the Macabre collection, I'm sorry to say that it is no longer in my possession, the unfortunate result of too much scotch and an impudent wager with my art dealer Tom on the subject of Elizabeth Bathory, a topic upon which he is the undisputed expert. I contacted Tom on your behalf, but was told that many years ago he had sold it on to a collector of macabre art who wished to remain anonymous. This is a great shame, as it was the last Pickman that I am aware of that was still available for public display. All others have apparently disappeared from history. Signed, Captain Stephen Abernathy, retired." So, I apologize that I don't have a color image of it to show you, but such is life and the history of this painting, apparently. Now, I believe that this was not a final painting. I think this is just my opinion. I think it was a study for a much larger and more detailed painting. But it was good enough to use for our black and white publication back in 1989, and also to use as a reference for my own illustrations for Pickman's model in that issue. And so now, if you will indulge me once again, I will take you through 3 illustrations that I personally did for Pickman's model back in those days. So let's take a look, and I appreciate your patience. Here is the title page that I illustrated for Pickman's model, and this is the only time that I drew the ghoul itself in any of these 3 illustrations here, but I was using the tombstone that he's hunching over there to be an initial cap for the lead-in of the first sentence in the story. "You needn't think I'm crazy, Elliot." But I was on a bit of a Art Nouveau kick back then, so I got a little carried away with that giant tail that's swirling down through the copy there. Then I kind of borrowed a little bit from Beardsley, that tree in the background with the tombstones. But it was a fun illustration to do, my own interpretation of an actual Pickman, and I'm not sure it's that true to the description in the Lovecraft story, but I do think that it bears a little bit more of a resemblance to the actual Pickman, if I do say so myself. Now, one of the things that I liked to do when I was doing the illustrations for the stories that we would run in the Midnight Crier was to base the characters in the scenes after myself and other friends of mine or people that were involved with Horror Hall. That was kind of a fun way of getting us into the stories themselves. And this next illustration here is a scene from the story where ghoul feeding was on display, and it's why Pickman was getting canceled, why he was being ostracized from the art clubs and museums of Boston back in those days. And the figure on the left there with his back to us, that's me back in those days there. Look at all that hair that I used to have in my Norfolk suit there, and my little museum brochure clutched in my hand there. And I guess I did draw the ghoul one more time in here, but in this case it's illustrating the actual painting hanging on a gallery wall. And then the other gentleman there in the frock coat, that's my pal John Gritz there, the Imagineer that built and engineered a lot of the devices we had in Horror Hall. And his lovely wife Valerie there is swooning or fainting as she gazes upon that horrific Pickman painting there. This last illustration here is the scene where Thurber has been invited down to Pickman's cellar basement in the north end of Boston and is being shown some sketches that he has drawn of the hideous and the terrible. And so that's me sitting in the chair there as Thurber, the character Thurber. Behind me, you can kind of see in the shadows there an easel that's set up there. And Pickman himself there, that's my old pal Steve Abernathy. And I was trying to go for the light coming up from under him, like when you're telling ghost stories at a campfire here. And I was trying to he wore a beard in those days. He still does. It's even a bigger beard now. But with that light coming up from below, I was trying to give him the effect of having kind of a werewolfish face. And so he's kind of embodying the ghouls that he is painting. So that's kind of what I was after in that drawing. So it's a shame that Pickman got away, but Captain Steve, as we refer to him now, still has quite a collection of artifacts and artwork and curiosities, a veritable museum, really, of things in his home bar and speakeasy, as he calls it, the Mermaid Grotto in Henderson, Nevada. He's kept collecting things over the years, and some artwork he produces, some he's collected, some he's inherited, some has been donated to him. He's got quite a curiosity collection there. And so I'm putting up just a kind of a panoramic shot of the grotto, as we call it, in Henderson there. And you can see Captain Steve himself standing there by his bar, and sitting there at the bar is our good pal Bob Malone, enjoying the atmosphere there. And a few years ago, another YouTuber, not a booktuber, but a YouTuber who does travel videos around the country, what he does is he travels the highways and byways of the country and stops off and does his video content on roadside attractions all over the country. And he got wind of Captain Steve's grotto and made a stop there. And if you're interested in seeing more of these artifacts and the stories behind them, and hear Captain Steve give a little tour himself to the Carpetbagger, his name is, the YouTube channel is the Carpetbagger. And I'll leave a link down below to the Mermaid Grotto video, and you can check that out and see some of the other bizarre things that he has. No more Pickmans in the collection anymore, but might be kind of fun for you to check out if you're interested. Oh, one last thing. If you're interested at all in reading that issue of the Midnight Crier yourself with the Pickman's model in it, and the Masterpiece of the Macabre, a bunch of other things too. I think there's a review in there of Pet Sematary when that first came out, and some other things that you may find of interest. If you would, I'd be happy to email you a copy. I've got it scanned in as a PDF, and it's only 4 or 5 megs. So let me know if you're interested in that, and I'd be happy to send it your way. And there you have it, folks. So this was a lot of fun to put together. It was a little bit a deeper dig than I usually do for my channel, but I had a lot of fun doing it, and I'm happy to finally get this thing out by the end of May here, running pretty close, like I am with these candles here, running close to empty on it. So I'll let you go for now. Sweet dreams, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks a lot.